In this lesson, we'll discuss how to install a SATA device on a PC system. Specifically, we're going to talk about how to install a SATA hard disk drive. Be aware that the steps are pretty much the same no matter which type of SATA device you install. For instance, the steps will be the same whether you're installing a SATA optical drive or a SATA SSD drive. Now, the first thing we need to do is gather all the components together. We'll need the hard disk itself, along with a SATA data cable. We also need to verify that the system's power supply has an available SATA power connector. This shouldn't be a problem with a modern power supply, but be aware that with older ones, you might find that there's a limited number of power connectors. Really old power supplies probably won't have any at all. If you find yourself in this situation, you could purchase a very inexpensive power adapter online. We don't have to worry about this issue with this system. The power supply has plenty of SATA power connectors available. Now that we have all the components we need, the next step is to physically install the drive in the PC case. We'll slide this drive into an empty drive bay and then secure it in place with 4 screws. Now, before you tighten things down, you should verify that the power and the SATA data cable can reach the drive. This really isn't an issue with smaller cases, but I've seen situations in very large PC cases where a cable, especially the power supply's power cable, doesn't reach the drive if you put it in the wrong drive bay. With the drive installed, the next step is to connect it to the power supply. To do this, we need to find the appropriate cable coming from the power supply. Before you connect the cable, match up the key on the cable's connector with the key on the drive's connector. I've observed PC technicians trying to connect the power connector upside down for more than 10 minutes before they realized that they were doing it wrong. Save yourself the trouble and embarrassment by making sure that you have the connector oriented properly before you try to plug it into the drive. We've got this connector oriented correctly, so we're going to plug it in. With the power connected, the next step is to connect the drive to the SATA interface on the motherboard. Be aware that on rare occasions, you may encounter a system that has a SATA card installed on an expansion slot on the motherboard. For example, the motherboard may have an older SATA 2 interface integrated into its hardware. To get better performance, a SATA 3 board was installed in an expansion slot. This was probably done to increase the disk I/O throughput speed. If this is the case, you'll need to use the SATA connectors on the card instead of the motherboard. Now, you probably won't see this on a modern motherboard. You'll most likely just be able to use the SATA connectors on the motherboard itself. That's what we're going to do here. First, I'll connect the SATA data cable to the drive itself. Notice that the SATA data cable is keyed just like the SATA power connector. Again, make sure that you have the connector oriented correctly. If you can't get the cable to plug in properly, don't force it. More than likely, you're just doing it upside down. Next, we need to connect the other end of the cable to the motherboard. Notice that this motherboard actually has several different SATA connectors available. Technically, you could connect to any one of them. But be aware that it's a best practice to connect the boot drive, which is the one that'll have the operating system installed on it, to the motherboard's lowest numbered SATA connector, such as SATA 0. By default, the BIOS or UEFI firmware will look for an operating system on this drive when the system boots. It's not the end of the world if you choose to use a different SATA connector, but you'll have to manually configure the boot drive in the BIOS or UEFI firmware. For our purposes, let's save ourselves the trouble and actually connect the drive to the lowest numbered SATA connector. Notice that the other end of the SATA data cable is keyed, so again, you need to make sure that you have it oriented correctly before you try to connect it. If it is, it should connect very easily, like this. If it isn't, it won't go in at all. Remember, don't try to force it, just turn it over and try again. With this done, the next step is to boot the system and verify that the drive has been detected by the BIOS or UEFI firmware. This is really nice because back in the olden days, the BIOS didn't auto-detect the hard disk drives that were connected to the storage interface. You had to manually configure the drive geometry, which consisted of a number of cylinders, heads, and sectors on each track. If you did it wrong, the drive would appear smaller than it actually was. If you really messed those parameters up, it might not have worked at all. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about this nowadays. The SATA drive's firmware talks to the motherboard's firmware and tells it everything it needs to know. All we have to do is make sure that the drive is listed. If the drive is going to store the operating system, you also need to make sure that the drive is listed as the bootable hard disk drive. If you make any changes, be sure to save them before you exit out of your BIOS or UEFI configuration utility. Before you can save any data on the drive, you'll have to partition and format it with the file system. If you're going to install an operating system on the drive, you don't need to worry about it because the operating system will partition and format the drive for you. If you want it as a data drive, you'll need to use the appropriate tool provided by your operating system. The way you do this will vary depending on whether you use Windows, Linux, or Mac OS. That's it for this lesson on SATA devices. We reviewed how to install a SATA drive on a PC system. We talked about physically installing the drive, connecting the power supply and the data cable, and we talked about verifying that the drive was detected by the BIOS or UEFI firmware.